The quiet before the storm. The familiar cocktail of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cologne usually brought Dean a strange comfort backstage. Tonight, however, it felt suffocating, a heavy shroud pressing in. The pre-show hum, typically a lively thrum in his ears, was a distant, muted drone. Suddenly, the shrill ring of the archaic rotary phone, its chipped receiver a testament to countless calls, pierced the quiet of his dressing room. He answered, anticipating a last-minute directive from the stage manager or perhaps even a call from Jeanne. Instead, a solemn voice, thick with an unfamiliar regional accent, delivered a blow that shattered his carefully constructed calm. Frank. Gone. A car accident. The words hung, impossibly leaden, dismantling his world into a million glittering fragments. He didn't recall replacing the receiver. It simply dangled, then dropped with a dull thud to the carpet. The mirror reflected a stranger, a man with vacant, wide eyes and a face utterly drained of colour. Frank. His Frank. The one who'd sparred with him, laughed with him, shared countless late-night whiskies and even more early-morning hangovers. The one whose booming voice and infectious spirit had been a bedrock in his life for decades. Now, only an echoing void remained. A sharp, impatient rap on the door broke through the mental fog. "Dean? 5 minutes, pal, the house is packed." It was Mikey, his usually unflappable stage manager. Dean blinked, the brutal reality of the situation crashing down once more. The show he was meant to perform. How could he possibly sing, joke and charm when his heart felt like a hollowed-out drum? A momentary flicker of reprieve. The thought of cancelling sparked, then quickly died. Frank wouldn't have wanted that. Frank, the quintessential showman, who always championed the mantra, "The show must go on." A dry, humourless laugh escaped him. He straightened his tie, the silk feeling rough against his skin, his hands trembling slightly before he willed them steady. The stage, the dazzling lights, the sea of expectant faces, that was where Frank would have wanted him. That was his rightful place. He stepped into the wings, the sudden roar of the crowd, a palpable wave. The glare of the lights was blinding, but he pressed forward, a practiced smile a mask on his face. The orchestra struck up his opening number, a jaunty tune he'd performed 1,000 times. He opened his mouth, and the familiar words delivered in his smooth baritone felt hollow, echoing in a vast emptiness within him. The first few songs were a blur, his movements automatic. He glided, gestured, sang, but his mind was a fractured landscape of shared memories and a crushing newly born grief. Then, halfway through his set, something shifted. He looked out at the faces, a sea of expectant smiles, and a fierce, almost primal love for his friend, for their shared history surged through him. He signalled the band to stop, a sudden jarring silence falling over the room. He drew a deep breath, the air thick with unspoken emotion. "Folks," he began, his voice surprisingly steady, I just got some news." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the hushed audience. "My best friend, Frank Sinatra. He passed away tonight." A collective gasp rippled through the room. He was a hell of a guy, and a hell of a performer. His voice wavered then, a hairline crack in his carefully constructed facade. He always said the show must go on, so tonight, this one's for him? He looked at the bandleader, a silent understanding passing between them. The opening notes of My Way filled the room, slower, more mournful than usual. As Dean sang, his voice raw with unshed tears, the audience sat in stunned silence, some openly weeping, sharing in the profound grief of a man performing his heart out for the friend he'd lost. The ringing silence. The insistent thrumming in Dean's head wasn't the telephone. It was the phantom echo of its last, shattering vibration. Backstage, the air hung heavy with cheap aftershave and the electric hum of 100 anxious performers. His hand, still quivering faintly, released the receiver. Frank, gone. The pronouncement settled in his gut like a lead anchor, a corporeal blow that stole his breath. Even as the distant roar of the audience swelled, a ravenous beast demanding sustenance. Arthur, his kindly old dresser, paused mid-knot on a tie. "Everything all right, Mr. Martin? You look a bit drained." Dean merely nodded, a choppy motion, alien to his customary smooth composure. He yearned to bellow, to shatter something, to simply collapse and weep until his eyes were parched. But the show, it loomed, moments away. His name emblazoned on countless posters, guaranteed an evening of effortless charm and melody. He was Dean Martin, and Dean Martin didn't falter. Not tonight. He drifted to the mirror, his own reflection a blur. His eyes, usually alight with mischief, were vacant, lustreless. The announcer's voice boomed, a theatrical prelude to his entrance. "Ladies and gentlemen, the one, the only." A cold sweat slicked his skin. Every nerve ending screamed for him to bolt, to vanish into the anonymous quiet of the alley outside. But then Frank's image coalesced in his mind. Frank, who would have personally dragged him back on stage if he had ever considered chickening out. Frank, who adored the spotlight more than life itself. Dean's shoulders stiffened, a silent war raging within. "Arthur," he rasped, his voice rougher than usual. "A double scotch. Neat." The glass felt icy in his grip, the amber liquid a fiery caress that spread through his chest, momentarily dulling the frigid ache. The curtain swept open, the blinding glare striking him like a physical impact. The crowd's roar, usually a soothing tide, was a jarring cacophony today. He forced a smile, a practiced facade that felt utterly alien. His opening number, a lively, familiar tune, tasted like ash in his mouth. He moved through the choreography, his voice a professional instrument, yet his spirit remained absent. His gaze, sweeping over the sea of faces, conjured only Frank's distinctive grin, heard only Frank's booming laugh. Mid-set, a wave of profound, undiluted grief washed over him. He halted the orchestra with an upraised hand, the sudden silence deafening. He drew a deep breath, the scotch offering little solace against the raw edges of his sorrow. "Folks," he began, his voice surprisingly steady despite an internal tremor. I just received some truly terrible news. My best friend, Frank Sinatra, he passed away a little while ago." A collective gasp rippled through the theatre, followed by a stunned, reverent hush. He met their gazes, at faces now etched with shock and shared sadness. A tear traced a path down his cheek, an unbidden rupture in his carefully constructed composure. He was truly one of a kind, and he loved this more than anything. He gestured to the stage, to the very air they breathed. "So tonight, this is for him." He launched into "My Way," not with his customary croon, but with a raw, potent honesty that stripped away every layer of performance. His voice cracked with emotion, soared with memory, and by the time the final notes faded, the entire audience was on its feet, not merely applauding, but weeping alongside him, sharing in the ringing silence of a world without Frank. A world stops turning. The phone, slick with sweat, felt like a lead weight in Dean's hand. He pressed it harder against his ear, as if proximity might change the words that had just been spoken. "Say that again, Artie," he managed, his voice a dry rasp against the sudden silence of his dressing room. The familiar cacophony of the sands, usually a comforting hum through the wall, had vanished, replaced by a roaring emptiness in his head. Artie's voice on the other end was thick, distant. "Sammy, he's gone, Dean. Heart attack. This morning." The world, which had been spinning at a dizzying pace just moments before, screeched to a halt. Dean's eyes, unfocused, landed on his reflection in the mirror. A man in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. A forced smile already etched onto his face in anticipation of the performance. The smile now felt like a grotesque mask. Sammy, gone. It was a phrase that refused to compute. Sammy, with his boundless energy, his infectious laugh, his constant, vibrant presence. He vaguely heard Artie offering condolences, asking if he needed a moment, if he wanted to cancel. Cancel? Tonight? The thought was a jarring intrusion. The house was packed. The orchestra was already warming up. But more than that, there was a visceral refusal to let this news consume him entirely. Not yet. Not before he stood in front of that crowd. Dean swallowed, the back of his throat raw. "No, Artie. Tell the band, tell them we're still on." He hung up before Artie could protest, the click echoing in the sudden, profound stillness. He stared at his reflection again. The mask was still there, but beneath it, his eyes were burning. Sammy, his best friend, his brother, the man who'd stood by him through triumphs and turmoil. He walked to the stage on autopilot, the murmur of the crowd a distant ocean. The spotlights were blinding, a harsh white glare that made the faces beyond the first few rows indistinguishable blurs. The orchestra struck up the opening chords of his first number, Everybody Loves Somebody. Dean's voice, surprisingly steady, filled the room. He sang not to the audience, but to Sammy. Each note was a silent conversation, a raw, unvarnished outpouring of grief and love. Mid-set, after a particularly poignant ballad, the usual patter died on his lips. A hush fell over the room, an almost palpable tension as Dean stepped forward, away from the microphone. He cleared his throat, the sound unusually loud. "Folks," he began, his voice deeper, more resonant than usual. Tonight is for my pal, for Sammy." A tear, unbidden, traced a path down his cheek. "He taught me everything I know about living, about laughing, about picking yourself up when you fall." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the sea of faces, now illuminated by the gentle stage lights. He was the best friend a guy could ever ask for, and he's up there now, probably telling God a joke. A choked sob escaped him, followed by a collective gasp from the audience. "So, if you'll bear with me, this next one's for him." He launched into a soulful, stripped-down rendition of My Way, his voice cracking with emotion, each word a testament to a friendship that had defied the odds. By the time the final note faded, the entire room was bathed in tears, a shared moment of profound sorrow and unwavering admiration. Echoes of laughter. The phone, a cold, heavy weight, seemed to thrum with a silent static in Dean's grip. He stared at the receiver, the dial tone a buzzing phantom against his ear. He'd just disconnected from Jean, her voice a strained murmur through the long-distance crackle. Frank. Gone. The pronouncement still felt alien, a jumble of syllables refusing to coalesce into meaning. He blinked, the dressing room's bright lights suddenly too harsh, blurring the posters on the wall into indistinct smudges. This couldn't be real. Not Frank. A sharp, insistent rap on the door jolted him back. 5 minutes, Mr. Martin," a muffled voice boomed. 5 minutes. 5 minutes until he was expected to stride onto that stage, to croon familiar melodies, to charm the eager faces. How could he possibly do that? How could he sing of love and laughter when his own heart felt like an empty drum? He raked a hand over his face, the stubble a prickle against his palm. His reflection in the mirror stared back, a stranger with haunted eyes. He pictured their last true laugh, a boisterous evening in Vegas, Frank's booming voice reverberating through the smoky room. The memory was a cruel twist, a phantom limb of joy. A deep tremor ran through him. He wouldn't cancel. Frank wouldn't have wanted him to. Frank, who lived for the spotlight, who embodied the mantra that the show must always go on. The decision, though agonizing, settled in his gut with a chilling resolve. He would perform. He would sing. And tonight, he would sing for Frank. The roar of the crowd enveloped him the instant he stepped into the spotlight, a wave of anticipation that usually invigorated him. Tonight, it pressed down like a physical burden. He forced a smile, the muscles in his face protesting the effort. The initial songs passed in a haze, his voice a mechanical reproduction of its usual effortless croon. He registered the faces, the smiles, the tapping feet, but felt utterly detached. It was during Memories Are Made of This that his gaze snagged on an empty seat in the third row, a spot Frank often claimed as his own. A lump, thick and unyielding, formed in his throat. He cleared it, the microphone suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice a little rougher than usual. I just received some news tonight." He paused, the collective hush of the audience pressing in. "A very dear friend of mine, a brother, passed away a few hours ago." He didn't need to utter the name. A collective gasp rippled through the room. He loved laughter, he loved music, and he loved this city. A tear traced a path down his cheek, but he made no move to wipe it away. "So tonight, this next one, it's for him, and it's for all the echoes of laughter he left behind." He nodded to the bandleader, and the opening notes of My Way filled the theatre, not as a defiant anthem, but as a tender, heartbreaking elegy. His voice, usually so smooth and easy, was laced with a raw, powerful grief that brought say tears to every eye in the house. The call to stage. The rotary phone, an anachronism in his modern dressing room, shrieked its insistent summons. Dean, mid-knot on his silk tie, paused, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. No one called him here unless it was urgent. He picked up, his customary "Dino here, what's the scoop?" faltering as he listened. The distant voice was tinny, yet the words hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. Frank passed away. A car accident. Just hours ago. The tie hung limp in his hands, the vibrant colours of his shirt, the polished gleam of his shoes, the smell of his cologne, everything suddenly felt artificial, a cheap veneer over a gaping wound. He stared at his reflection, but it wasn't his own eyes staring back. They were distant, unfocused, already brimming with unshed tears. Frank, his buddy, his brother, gone, a sharp rap on the door. 5 minutes, Mr. Martin, the stage manager's voice boomed, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred within the room. 5 minutes until he had to walk out there, smile, sing, crack jokes. How? How could he do that when his world had just imploded? He sank onto the plush velvet sofa, the phone still clutched in his hand. The weight of it felt immense, like a lead pipe. He thought of the laughter, the endless nights, the knowing glances across crowded rooms. Frank, always there, a constant. Now, a gaping void. The thought of cancelling, of retreating, was a siren song, promising sanctuary. But then he remembered Frank's unyielding spirit, his insistence on the show going on, no matter what. Frank wouldn't have wanted him to back out. He would have wanted him to sing. With a deep, shuddering breath, Dean stood. His hands trembled as he finished knotting his tie, the silk suddenly feeling like a noose. He splashed cold water on his face, the shock momentarily clearing the fog from his mind. He looked at himself again, really looked. The man staring back was a performer, yes, but more than that, he was a friend, and he had a tribute to pay, and the roar of the crowd was a distant hum as he walked towards the stage door. His usual pre-show swagger was absent, replaced by a resolute, almost grim determination. The lights were blinding as he stepped into the spotlight, a wave of applause washing over him. He lifted a hand, a weak smile touching his lips. He started with a familiar melody, his voice a little rougher than usual, a new, raw edge to it. He moved through the first few songs, the words a blur, the music a shield. Then, in the quiet between numbers, he cleared his throat. "Folks," his voice was hoarse, a tremor running through it that no one in the audience had ever heard before. I just got some very sad news. My dear friend, Frank Sinatra, he passed away today." A collective gasp rippled through the theatre, followed by a stunned silence. Tears welled in Dean's eyes, unbidden, streaming down his cheeks. He didn't bother to wipe them away. He was more than a friend, he was family. And tonight I'm singing for him. He launched into My Way, his voice breaking on the first few lines, but then finding a strength born of pure, unadulterated grief. Every note, every word was a eulogy, a raw testament to a bond that death could not sever. By the time the final chords faded, the audience was weeping with him, sharing in his profound loss, witnessing a man perform not just for an audience, but for a ghost. A mask of smiles. The phone's strident shriek lacerated the hushed dressing room's calm. Dean, adjusting his tie, flinched. He'd been admiring the crisp white shirt, the impeccably creased trousers, anticipating a packed house. Tonight's significant performance fueled a palpable hum backstage. He casually answered, "Dean Martin." The voice on the other end, usually unflappable, was clipped, strained. The stage manager's. His words tumbled out, "Mr. Martin, it's about Frank." Dean's hand, fumbling with a cufflink, froze. A sudden, sharp chill of dread pierced through the pre-show adrenaline. He closed his eyes for a moment, bracing himself. The words, detached from reality, seemed to drift in the small mirrored space. Frank. An accident. Gone. The receiver clattered back, the subsequent silence a physical weight. Deafening. Frank. His confidant. His companion in laughter and song, the man who'd seen him through every rough patch, whose quick wit could always lift his spirits. Now, simply extinguished, he stared at his reflection. A stranger with wide, incredulous eyes. The pristine shirt, the sharp trousers, suddenly felt like a costume for a play he no longer wished to perform. The murmur of the orchestra tuning, the distant chatter of the audience, usually a comforting prelude, now felt like a cruel mockery. A gentle but insistent knock sounded. 5 minutes, Mr. Martin. 5 minutes. 5 minutes to transmute this raw, gaping wound into a mask of smiles. 5 minutes to bury the crushing grief under layers of practiced charm and effortless cool. His gaze drifted to a half-empty glass of amber liquid on his vanity. He didn't touch it. Not tonight. Tonight, clarity was paramount. Tonight, he needed to embody Frank's spirit. He drew a deep, shuddering breath, the air searing his lungs. He approached the mirror again, forcing the corners of his mouth upward. A grotesque parody of his usual grin. It felt wrong, a betrayal. But the show, as they say, must go on. Frank would have insisted. Frank, with his unwavering belief in performance's power, in entertainment's sheer joy. He squared his shoulders, a tremor coursing through him. The stage beckoned, a vast, hungry space awaiting his presence. He would fill it. He would sing, he would joke, he would smile, and somewhere nestled deep within the music's rhythm, within the sparkle of his eyes, he would find a way to honour the man he had lost. The curtain was poised to rise, and Dean Martin, his heart splintering into 1,000 pieces, stepped out to meet his audience. A song of tears unsung. The phone, slick with nervous sweat, felt like a lead ingot in his palm. Dean stared at the receiver. The dial tone a piercing shriek in the hushed dressing room. He couldn't sever the connection, not yet. His manager, a ghost of himself, had delivered the blow just moments ago, a choked, stark pronouncement that had sucked the air from Dean's lungs. Jerry. Gone. A car accident. The words echoed, hollow and razor-edged, in the confines of the small space. He didn't picture the man he hadn't spoken to in years, but the Jerry of their burgeoning days, a whirlwind of gangly limbs and wide, guileless eyes, a laugh that could splinter glass and yet mend the most wounded spirit. The kid who'd once stumbled backstage and somehow transformed it into an impromptu ballet, leaving Dean convulsed with mirth. That Jerry was now a memory. A soft yet insistent rap came from the door. "Dean, 5 minutes." It was the stage manager, blissfully unaware. Dean swallowed, his throat raw as parched earth. His reflection showed a stranger, eyes vacant and distant, a subtle tremor in his jaw. He was due on stage to 1,000 eager faces, to croon light-hearted melodies and deliver witty banter. He was supposed to be Dean Martin, the epitome of effortless cool, the king of the easy charm. He drew a slow, deliberate breath, the air thick with stale cigarette smoke and cheap cologne. The show, it had to go on. Jerry, he knew, would have insisted. Jerry, who thrived on the crowd's roar, who lived for the spotlight's embrace. It was the only way Dean knew to honour him, to let the music bear the crushing weight. Stepping onto the stage was like drifting into a dreamscape. The lights were a blinding assault, the applause a distant, muffled tide. He found his mark, a phantom ache, a persistent throb in his chest. The band launched into Everybody Loves Somebody, a tune he'd sung untold times. His voice, usually a smooth, resonant current, felt fragile. A thin thread stretched taut to breaking. He caught sight of a woman in the third row, her smile wide and bright, and for a fleeting instant he nearly faltered. He navigated the first verse, then the chorus, the lyrics a bitter irony on his tongue. During the instrumental interlude, he gripped the microphone stand, his knuckles stark white against the chrome. He surveyed the human tapestry before him, their anticipation a tangible force. "Folks," he began, his voice surprisingly steady, though it caught on the final syllable. I just got some news tonight. My best friend, my very best friend, Jerry Lewis, he passed away." A collective gasp rippled through the auditorium, followed by a profound, stunned hush. Dean felt a tear escape, tracing a hot path down his cheek. He made no move to wipe it away. He was a genius. A wild, beautiful genius. He paused, searching for the precise words, for a way to articulate the fathomless chasm that had just cleaved his world in two. "Tonight, this one's for him." He nodded to the bandleader, who, with an unspoken understanding, launched into a slow, haunting rendition of You'll Never Walk Alone. Dean sang, not as the polished Dean Martin, but as a man laid bare, his voice a testament to raw grief. Each note was a eulogy, each word a cherished memory. The audience, once a faceless blur, now felt like a singular collective heart beating in rhythm with his sorrow. By the time the final chords faded into silence, the theatre was utterly still, save for the soft sound of weeping. Dean stood there, bathed in the solitary spotlight, and finally, completely let the tears fall, a heartfelt goodbye. The persistent ring of the backstage phone cut through the pre-show hum like a splintered note. Dean, tightening his tie knot in the mirror, frowned. This wasn't the usual jingle. He answered, anticipating a last-minute schedule tweak or a fan club query. Dean Martin speaking. His voice, typically a warm wry, had a faint edge of impatience. The caller's tone, unfamiliar and official, carried an undertone of profound sorrow. Mr. Martin, I'm calling from St. Francis Hospital. It's about Mr. Sinatra. Dean's grip on the receiver whitened his knuckles. The mirror showed a sudden, stark fear in his eyes. The words, complications, earlier this evening, he's gone, seemed to ricochet off a newly erected wall in his mind. The vibrant theatre world outside the booth blurred, dimming to a muted grey. Frank, gone. His confidant, his comrade, the man who had always been a steadfast presence, a force of nature, a voice that could shake the heavens. A stagehand poked his head in. 5 minutes, Mr. Martin. Dean offered a mechanical nod. He replaced the receiver, its clatter echoing in the sudden void of his world. A physical ache blossomed in his chest, his breath catching. How could he step onto that stage? How could he belt out jaunty tunes and crack jokes when his heart felt like a raw, exposed nerve? The thought of cancelling flashed, a desperate plea for solitude, for a moment to absorb this impossible truth. But then he remembered Frank. Frank, who would have told him to kick himself out there, to give them a show no matter the cost. Frank, who lived for the stage, for that electric connection with the audience. He walked to the wings, the roar of the crowd a distant, alien surf. The stage lights were blinding as he stepped into the spotlight, their familiar warmth doing little to thaw the chill deep within his bones. He forced a smile, a mask worn 1,000 times, but tonight it felt perilously fragile, on the verge of splintering. He launched into his opening number, the lyrics feeling hollow, a cruel mockery of cheer. His voice, usually effortless, felt strained, each note a struggle against the rising tide of grief. Midway through his set, a profound hush fell over the audience during a pause between songs. He looked out at the sea of faces, their expectation palpable. This was it. He cleared his throat, the sound rough. "Folks," he began, his voice surprisingly steady, I just received some news." His gaze swept over them, a deep well of sorrow in his eyes. "My best friend Frank Sinatra passed away earlier tonight." A collective gasp rippled through the theatre. Dean took a deep breath, the pain a sharp, constant companion. He was one of a kind, a legend, and a hell of a friend. He paused, his voice thickening with emotion. He loved this stage. He loved you all, and I know he'd want me to keep singing. He looked heavenward, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. "So, this next one, this one's for Frank." He nodded to the band leader, and the mournful strains of My Way filled the room. Dean sang, not with his usual smooth croon, but with a raw, guttural honesty that tore at the heartstrings. Each word was a eulogy, each note a tear. By the time the final chords faded, the entire audience was on their feet, not just applauding, but weeping, sharing in the profound loss Dean had so bravely laid bare. The unforgettable farewell. The scent of stale beer and cheap cologne, usually a familiar comfort, now seemed to cling to Dean like a shroud. He stood backstage, the murmur of the Las Vegas crowd a distant ocean, his hand still tingling from the phone receiver. The words, "He's gone, Dean," echoed in the hollow space behind his eyes. Jerry. His Jerry. A laugh track from a million shared memories suddenly cut short. He felt a hand on his shoulder, gentle but firm. 5 minutes, Mr. Martin." It was Lenny, the stage manager, his usual jovial expression replaced by a worried frown. Dean could only nod, a tight knot forming in his throat. He looked at his reflection in the dusty mirror, a stranger staring back, pale, eyes rimmed with an unfamiliar grief. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to lock himself away from the bright lights and expectant faces. But Jerry wouldn't have wanted that. Jerry, with his boundless energy and ridiculous antics, would have demanded the show go on. He walked out onto the stage, the spotlight a searing interrogation. The applause was a wave, then a sudden hush as the band struck up his opening number. Dean's voice, usually a smooth bourbon, felt like gravel in his throat. He started, the lyrics to "Everybody Loves Somebody" tasting like ash. His eyes scanned the sea of faces, each one a potential reminder of a shared joke, a spontaneous outburst, a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. He saw a woman in the third row dab at her eyes, perhaps caught in the romantic melody, perhaps sensing the tremor beneath his usual swagger. Midway through a crooned verse, he stopped. The band faltered, then quieted. A nervous cough rippled through the audience. Dean stepped away from the microphone, walked to the edge of the stage, and looked out. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He cleared his throat, the sound amplified, raw. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice barely a whisper, then gaining strength. Tonight is a hard night." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the upturned faces. "I just received some news. My best friend, my partner in everything, Jerry Lewis, he passed away this evening." A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by murmurs of sympathy. Dean felt a tear escape, tracing a warm path down his cheek. He didn't bother to wipe it away. "Jerry, he would have wanted me to sing. He would have told me to make you laugh." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a melancholic memory. "And I'm going to try, but first..." He returned to the microphone, the spotlight catching the sheen in his eyes. This one is for Jerry. From me. From us." The first notes of "You'll Never Walk Alone" filled the cavernous room, slow and deliberate. Dean sang, not with his usual playful charm, but with a raw, exposed emotion that gripped every soul in the room. His voice, usually so effortless, now carried the weight of a lifetime of friendship, a profound farewell. The audience, usually boisterous and lively, sat in stunned silence, many openly weeping. It was a performance stripped bare, a eulogy woven into melody, surtout an unforgettable farewell.